Welcome to the 56th installment of Ear to the Ground, the Land Stewardship Project's audio magazine podcast. Ear to the Ground features interviews and field reports related to sustainable agriculture, family farming, local food systems, and local democracy. I'm Brian DeVore, editor of the Land Stewardship Letter. Using agricultural crops to feed our seemingly insatiable hunger for energy is generating a lot of excitement these days. So far, most of that attention to biofuels has centered around making ethanol out of corn. However, concerns have been raised that corn-based biofuels will only increase our reliance on an annual monocrop that can be very resource-intensive and have a negative impact on the environment. Increasingly, scientists, farmers, and economists have been considering the idea of using perennial plant systems such as native prairies as a source of biofuels. In theory, utilizing prairies has several advantages. For one thing, they only have to be planted once rather than on an annual basis. And when prairies are established, they don't need a constant supply of agrochemicals to stay productive. We should also keep in mind all of the ecological services such diverse systems provide: cleaner water, carbon sequestration, and wildlife habitat, to name a few. One idea is to use cutting-edge cellulosic technology to break down plants and ferment the resulting sugars into ethanol. Such a process would require expensive, sophisticated facilities and is not commercially feasible yet. But biofuel enthusiasts are also experimenting with existing technology to derive energy from native prairie. One of those experimenters is Eric Kreidermacher. Kreidermacher's family owns and operates Pork and Plants, a southeast Minnesota farm that, true to its name, raises pigs as well as greenhouse plants. Pork and Plants has 65,000 feet of greenhouse space. Keeping all that greenhouse real estate warm through a Minnesota winter can consume tremendous amounts of LP gas. So for years, the Kreidermachers have been seeking out alternative sources of energy. In 2003, they installed their first Stoker boiler. They've since installed more boilers on the farm, and over the years, they've mostly burned wood pellets and corn in them to provide steam heat for their greenhouses. But those forms of fuel have to be purchased, and Eric is interested in growing his own fuel right on the farm. He's also interested in doing it in a way that's good for the environment. So a few years ago, they planted 20 acres of native prairie on the farm. They've also purchased 2 machines that will allow them to reduce plant material into dense pellets that will burn efficiently. The prairie has taken a few years to get established, and when I visited the farm, the Kreidermachers were just about ready to harvest it, pelletize it, and test it out as a fuel source. They are also experimenting with using annual Sudan grass as a source of biofuel. In addition, the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources has shown interest in allowing the family to harvest some native prairie off of a wildlife refuge that borders the farm. Eric is excited about all of this potential for producing his own homegrown fuel, but he's also a little nervous. The family is taking on a major financial risk and is doing a lot of experimenting in an area of biofuels production that is still very much in its formative stages. He sells boilers himself and has seen a growing interest in his neighborhood on the part of farmers who would like to use these boilers to generate fuel from grasses and other plants grown right on their land. Eric would like to see a future in which neighboring farmers raise prairie grass and then haul it to his farm where it can be pelletized. These farmers would then take the pellets back to their own operations where they could be burned in their own boilers. Such a local energy system would be good for the local environment as well as the local economy. But for now, all of that is still in the dreaming stage. On a windy afternoon in early fall, I visited Pork and Plants and got a tour of the Kreidermachers' budding biofuel operation. At one point, Eric took me to the plot of land where they have planted native prairie on one side and Sudan grass on the other. There we talked about the potential, challenges, and unanswered questions that swirl around the idea of plugging into the prairie. We're kind of standing here. We've got Sudan grass on one side here. You said you got about 20 to 25 acres of that. And then you've got the native prairie planted here right on the right-hand side here. And I was wondering if you had talked a little bit about some of you're kind of doing this research on your own. And you've got some major questions about whether you can make this viable economically for your operation as far as biomass production. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about some of those questions you're trying to answer here, kind of with this on-farm research.
Yeah, the big question with all this biomass idea, or the question behind all this, is coming down to the profitability for the farm level, how it's going to work on the farm scale. We're looking at the native prairie. We're also looking at the native annual grasses to kind of compare and see. The big questions come down to the yield. what kind of tons we're going to see off of these fields, both on the native systems and also on an annual system. Yeah, the questions too are the production side questions that nobody can really answer me right now. Say, like I said before, with myself being a farmer, especially being a hog farmer, is if it's advantageous to try to use the manure production out of that side of my business, if it would be beneficial to put on the prairie in terms of making it better, getting more tons, more yield. That's stuff that apparently I'm going to have to figure out myself, because unfortunately there hasn't been any research done into that side. Most of my side is looking at on the farm scale and in the mindset of a typical farmer, how it fits into our system that we're used to. The big thing that scares a lot of people, a lot of farmers, is the idea of is the difference between a monoculture system and a diverse system, how that's going to play out too. Most farmers are very typical, are very mindset into a monoculture, cropping system. The prairie is a much diverse, polyculture, more species planted into it, which I think is going to be beneficial, and also a very beneficial thing too for long-term viability of it. But that's the other question we have too, is between a straight grass planting versus a grass and forward planting, which one's going to do better in terms of yield again, but also do better in terms of long-term viability. A lot of my thoughts is still going to be the diverse, the diverse planting between with the grasses and the forbs, where one feeds the other. But say it's all things that will be, we have to figure out in the next couple of years here as things progress, because you keep going back to, unfortunately, there isn't a lot of research out there for anything on a farm scale system right now.
Yeah, and one of the things you talked about is maybe to make this work economically is for, say, the government to recognize that, say, this prairie system isn't just, you aren't just raising it for biomass, but it has other services that it can provide, kind of eco services like wildlife habitat and helping filter water and that type of thing, protect the soil. Exactly.
I mean, yeah, the whole overall picture is there's a lot of different benefits. I mean, the number one benefit for myself and people like me is the biofuel side of it, for the fuel side. But yet, the environmental benefits are numerous. You got the wildlife benefit that you're going to get. You also got the water quality. It's going to help with that, with the runoffs. Your insects and beneficial insects and stuff. It brings back into the farming scheme, the diversity that we used to have that we don't see anymore. And say to make it, and I think long term to make it viable, we're going to have to see government policies both on the state and the federal level to help to further this and compensate the farmer, especially for the get-go. To give incentives for these other benefits that the farmer themselves actually can really grasp grasp in hand. It's more the social benefits that you're going to see to the community, which is a good part of it. But yet there's got to be incentives to help kind of support that side of it, to make it feasible on the farm scale that we're trying to do.
Well, you were talking about this how farmers really want to focus on that monoculture because that's where they get the yield, and you really see it here. The Sudan grass, which is an annual monoculture, it's what is it? 14 foot high. It's way above our heads here, and I don't know, at least 12 foot high. And then you look at the prairie system here. It looks really nice. It's a nice, diverse system. You can see a lot of insects in there. A lot of wildlife is probably making its home there, but it's maybe the height of our knee, so it's not as impressive. And I'm sure, like you said, somebody said that you'd be lucky to get maybe 1.5 ton yield out of that, and that's not going to turn a lot of heads right now as far as productivity.
No, exactly, and that's the question myself primarily has is what kind of mixes are going to give us the best yields on the farm for what we want to do. The big advantage that I see to the prairie over the annual plantings is still the long-term viability. If we can get it all figured out, is the beauty of a prairie system is you aren't really on the land very often. I mean, once it's established, at the most you're going to be on the land once a year to harvest it. Where any of your annual systems, the annual grasses to your traditional corn and beans, there's quite a few trips across the field that we make in terms of fuel consumption and compaction and just machinery, wear and tear on machinery. So that's another side of the prairie that I see as a benefit that it makes it much more attractive on a production side, is that you're not really on that land very often. But they'll say the question all comes back to making it economically viable, that it becomes another option for some of this land that are on our farms that could be used for better things besides traditional row crops.
Yeah, especially see it in this area here where it's a very hilly area. We got the Whitewater River down the hill here. There's been some history of erosion in this area. I mean, your land's obviously very well managed, but in some of these places, corn and beans really aren't the thing to be planting on some of these hillsides. So it'd be good to see some kind of a perennial system.
No, exactly, and that's what, in the county that we're in, that's what we really need to see. Is, unfortunately, we've seen too much of the contour strips, too much of the waterways. Things have disappeared over the years as things have developed. Unfortunately, on the conventional agricultural system. I can see, in my mind, I still can see the day when you can have the two systems coexist together. The idea of having conventional row crops in conjunction with, a prairie system for biofuel or various things, and together, because one still can kind of help benefit the other. The big thing in the area we're in, there's a lot of land that should be much more productive, hopefully, in a prairie system or kind of system versus a conventional conventional corn and beans. And if you can tie the two together, with the water quality benefits and the beneficial insect benefits, that's going to have a benefit on the conventional system if we can bring that diversity back into our area. One's going to kind of help the other to a degree. Is what I see long term. It's just a matter of getting to that point.
One kind of exciting thing you mentioned was that you sell, one of your businesses you have is you sell boilers for biomass, and you're seeing more of your neighbors buying these systems for their own heating needs. But then they're also coming to you and saying, because you have two pelleting mills of your own to pelletize biomass into something that can be burned efficiently, and they're saying, we're interested in planting our own prairies or planting our own biomass systems, and then maybe using the pelleting mills here, and you see that as maybe eventually there could be kind of a regional system for processing this biomass and kind of creating a regional source of energy in the area.
Yeah, that's one of my long-term goals is to try to develop and see if we can make a regional system where farmers can kind of grow. If they choose to go into the biomass heating system idea is to grow their own fuel, and say what we're going to be set up capability-wise is that capability of various farmers, neighboring farmers, to bring me the material that they want to grow, if it's native grasses or whatever they want to do, and pelletize it for them, and then take it back and burn it. I mean, the whole idea of producing your own fuel is becoming very attractive to a lot of people. I have a lot of neighbors, actually a couple of customers of mine that I've sold the boilers to, that they've already started that process along with me here. They've planted their own native plantings with the idea that that's what they want to do with certain pieces of their land on their farm. Once it comes down to yield again, but I mean, if we can get the proper yield, I mean, an average farm, it's not going to take very many acres of land for an average farm to produce their own, heat, their own fuel for their heat demand of the year. And that's kind of a neat thing. Is, I mean, if you take a 4, which might be unrealistic yet, but if you take a 4 ton to the acre yield on biomass, I mean, a couple acres is about all an average house is going to consume for fuel in a year. And that's not, so a lot of people are very interested in the idea, of taking a few acres of land that might not be very productive and make it something that's much more beneficial out of it to them for their heating needs, but also, and then going back to the, extra benefits, for the environment itself. So it's interesting to see and neat to see, and time will tell how it all develops. But I mean, there's, I'm myself is definitely seeing a lot of interest. Quite a few phone calls every week. People asking, where we're at and what we're seeing.
Well, like you said, your neighbors may think you're crazy, but maybe you can prove them wrong in a few years.
That's the plan.
For more information on the Kreidermacher family operation, see www.porkandplants.com. That's porkandplants.com, all one word. For more on the issue of making biofuel from prairie grass, see the summer 2008 issue of the Land Stewardship Letter at www.landstewardshipproject.org. Send your comments and suggestions about this podcast to me, Brian DeVore, at bdevore@landstewardshipproject.org. You can also call me at 612-729-6294. A special thank you goes out to Laura Borgendale, a Western Minnesota musician who provided Ear to the Ground's theme music. And a very special thank you to all of Land Stewardship Project's members who make initiatives such as this podcast possible. If you're not a member, you'd like to support us, go to landstewardshipproject.org to learn how to join LSP. Thanks for listening.